Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Cal MacDonald to the Grappler Studio. Cal and I started talking years ago, and I was really impressed by his approach to learning and his approach to the techniques, but more importantly, how to introduce the techniques and how to train the techniques and how to get people to learn as fast as possible. Clearly, people get good at Jiu-Jitsu a whole bunch of different ways, but some of those ways people get good almost despite their learning method. And it takes a lot longer than I think it should have to. And some ways and some training methods are more efficient. And I was just really impressed by your philosophy about that and how to accelerate learning as fast as possible.
Bold claims, Stephan, but much appreciated.
Cal, I'd like to start out by picking your brain about your training philosophy and about the science that goes into designing a training regimen.
I had a really unique experience with Jiu-Jitsu. I think that's fair to say. And what I mean by that is I trained when I was younger. So in my teens, I trained a little bit. And when I was about 25, I decided to take Jiu-Jitsu pretty seriously. And I did it professionally, like as my day job, coaching Jiu-Jitsu for the better part of a decade, right? So the late part of my 20s, my early 30s, I'm focusing on how to be as effective as possible as a Jiu-Jitsu instructor. And I was really passionate about it. I love learning. I love being able to amplify my own skill set, being able to develop myself. And it's honestly extremely gratifying to be able to pass that kind of thing on to other people. So I got deep into the science of learning and what's available in that context. What I started on was the majority of concepts that I found initially in learning have to do with cognitive sciences. So this is something that I found that was incredibly interesting that I learned that plays a huge role into why we're doing what we're doing now. Essentially, and I want to make sure I explain what's useful to you and stay within my bounds. I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not technically a professional in terms of teaching. I was a professional coach for a period of time, but just as the caveat to say, like, I'm trying to provide value without overstepping and saying something that isn't completely accurate. But I have found a lot of information. I've read a number of different books and I've taken in content from different angles. So the basic idea here is, and I haven't seen this in many places, so I find it quite fascinating. We have two broad memory systems as humans. We have a cognitive memory system, so it fits under what's called declarative memory, the kind of memories that you can declare, things that you've read or you've experienced. I can bring them up in conversation, something that I remembered, from some period of time ago. I can declare that to someone else. That's a particular type of memory.
What, this place has great sushi?
Yeah, that would be a form of declarative memory. Yes, that's a memory that I've had that I can express to someone else. So in context of Jiu-Jitsu, thinking of concepts, so center of gravity, momentum, recognizing these things and being able to express them to another person, that fits into that cognitive declarative memory. Now, by contrast, we have learning motor skills, which fits into procedural memory, or a more broad category of that is non-declarative memory. The reason this is important is we've identified, not we, but, methods have been identified by people who've studied these fields that recognize the most effective way to approach developing declarative memory and non-declarative memory. So within the realm of declarative memory, one book that I found that summarized this very well is called Make It Stick. And it goes over a number of different learning strategies to help you to remember things in a cognitive sense. So you're studying for a test, right? It helps you to remember particular information. There's chunking information. There's interleaving different types of information, different topics. Retrieval is a major element of the cognitive approach to learning. So trying to remember something that you've almost forgot has been proven to be very effective in improving your long-term memory of that particular thing. Okay, so just as an example, there's this one strain of cognitive declarative memory. Then on the other side, non-declarative memory, specifically in that space is procedural memory, which has to do with learning motor skills. So you're actually going to employ somewhat different techniques to make your learning more efficient when you're trying to develop motor skills versus the declarative memory.
So can we just take this back to Jiu-Jitsu for a second? Can you give me examples of both of those again?
Yeah, so declarative memory, again, maybe you're remembering techniques. Maybe you have
So the angle that my thumb should be if I'm doing an armbar?
Yeah. Like the steps you would walk through. So, if I'm going for a rear naked choke, I'm going to position my hand like this. I'm going to begin putting pressure behind the jaw. I want to have my hand hooking the scapula. I want to blade my fingers. Like, it's the portion of it that isn't me physically performing the task. It's my cognitive knowledge of the actual task. Okay, so I can explain jiu-jitsu like we are right now without actually doing it. That has nothing to do with my ability to actually do jiu-jitsu, right?
So then what is the motor skill part of that? Is the feel part of it?
Yes, it very much is. Muscle memory is an interesting term. I think it's a bit of a misnomer. Muscle itself doesn't necessarily have the memory. It's your nervous system, it's your brain that holds that memory. So to train that type of memory, it's essentially through practice. Like that's what it boils down to. There is one concept that I've found that's particularly useful in that space, and that has to do with essentially attempting to do something and then recognizing the outcome of that thing. And if that outcome deviates from your expectation in the actual practice, the greater the deviation between what you thought would happen, what actually happened, results in more learning. Okay? So it's called reward prediction error. And this is the area where I don't want to get too into the weeds because I only have so much knowledge. The example that I read that was most efficient at conveying this point was you go to pick up a jug of milk that's in the fridge, okay? It's an opaque jug. You can't see through it. You go to pick it up and you just throw it across the room because you thought it was full, but it was actually empty. So your prediction was that this was going to be a full jug, it would be heavy. But in reality, it was an empty jug. So your calculation as to how much effort you should have put forth in picking that up was completely incorrect. The next time you go to do that, because of how much of a deviation there was between your expectation and reality, you're going to be that much more prepared to approach that in a way where you're unlikely to throw the jug. You're going to assume that, hey, I don't know what's in that jug. I'm not going to launch it across the room.
So I learn a closed guard sweep where the guy stands up, I grab his ankles, and I sweep him. I expect to end up on top, but instead he heel hooks me and he wins the match. There's a big difference between what I had hoped the outcome to be and what the actual outcome was. So I learned more in that moment than if it had just worked the way I expected it to work.
More or less. As I understand it, that's what it comes down to. Now, the idea really is that when you perform any movement, a number of neurons are firing throughout your body. And there's a general concept in neuroscience, neurons that fire together, wire together. So that's essentially what practice is. If I move into a particular position, a number of neurons are firing. I recognize with my eyes where things are in space and time. I can feel with my body where things are. And so the more I practice a particular movement, the more all of those neurons are firing at the same time, and it creates a memory within my nervous system of that particular exchange. So in the context of what you were just saying, and in the context of learning as efficiently as possible, we want to set up training such that my opponent is giving me enough resistance that I'm having success from time to time, but I'm not always successful and I'm not never successful. Because I need to be in this sweet spot where I'm, if I go up against, if a student goes up against me and they do something correctly, I more or less allow them to perform that technique and, they sweep me and I let them sweep me. In that moment, a beginner might be like, wow, as if that actually worked. That is believed to release a lot of dopamine and likely other neurochemicals in that scenario that stamp in that learning situation much greater than it otherwise would have been if the result was what they predicted it to be. Okay? So we want to create situations in training where people are having success, but at a degree that is kind of in that sweet spot where they're not necessarily expecting it, but when it happens, they're like, damn, that actually worked. So if I let like a lower level, maybe a white belt, if they do something correctly, I let them actually sweep me. So they're like, wow, that actually had success. I didn't expect it to have success because this person's much higher level than me, right? So that's the general idea. It's as you get into practice, you're firing particular neurons, you're developing memories, not in a cognitive sense, but in a procedural sense in your nervous system. And so really the physical practice, this isn't rocket science by any means. And I think it's a ridiculous phrase because it's not even remotely close. We're just grappling on the ground. But it's not rocket science in any means. You're basically practicing at a temperament that allows for you to have a reasonable amount of success while using techniques that have been proven at the higher level. So you're not wasting time on things that are only going to work against beginners. Okay, so in a general sense, on top of using this idea of procedural memory and that being our priority in terms of training, if you want to be a coach, absolutely. I mean, and in general as a student, you should also focus on the declarative side of memory as well. You can use it for tactics in the moment. You can use it for strategy. You can use it to develop your game. You can use the declarative side to critique your own training. Am I following certain concepts or principles and so on? But there is research into, for example, professional hockey goalies, right? Think of it like this. if I'm in the moment, I've never been a goalie for more than 5 minutes in my life, maybe an hour. But if I'm sitting there and someone like fires a puck at me and I need to catch it, right? I'm really on point with my terminology in hockey. As a Canadian, I'm a horrible Canadian.
A hockey puck thing.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, in the moment, am I going to, in my mind, say, okay, they've launched the puck from this angle. It's likely going to end up in this position, and I'm going to have to move my arm in this way to catch the puck and so on, right? There's no way. There's no way. It's like in Major League Baseball, there's this idea that if you start at a certain point in life, you're never going to be able to hit the ball of a pro pitcher because of the amount of calculations that are happening in a batter's head when the ball is released. They have so much experience of seeing the ball released, the way the pitcher is throwing the ball and so on, that when they swing, so much of what they're doing is being calculated with a ridiculous amount of experience. And that comes down to that procedural memory, right? So
the whole Michael Jordan not being unable, the world's best basketball player being unable. Now we're talking about two more sports I know nothing about.
Huge basketball fan though, so there's that.
Michael Jordan, world's best basketball player, being
Yeah.
unable to switch to play baseball, even when all the incentives were there, even when he had access to the best coaching, and he was an amazing athlete to start with.
For sure. And I mean, exactly. That's a perfect example. Crazy talented athlete, but he just doesn't have the experience that the other major league players have at that very niche skill of recognizing and interpreting the pitch, as it's released to turn that into a successful hit.
So arguably what we're trying to do here is create a condensed method for generating as much experience as you can in a reasonable amount of time.
Precisely. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Yeah. And so in doing that, aside from the background in terms of, really the science behind how we're approaching what we're doing, there are a number of broad things that we're trying to achieve, right? And a number of broad concepts that you can keep in mind while you're training with this methodology. Okay. The first one relates to basically alignment, if you're familiar with this concept. I'm going to generalize and say that you want to be in an athletic stance all the time. Okay. That means that you're biomechanically efficient virtually all the time. Okay. Your opponent is biomechanically efficient. You're biomechanically efficient. What does that mean? Okay. Generally speaking, that means neutral spinal alignment. The further my spine gets away from a neutral position, I'm going to be less able to generate force or absorb force. I also want to try use the muscles that are closest to the center line of my body. This might not be something that you're cognitively going to consider in the moment, but if you are breaking down a particular technique, you're trying to use the biggest muscles that are closest to the center line of your body. That's a general biomechanical principle. Proximal is closest to the center line. Distal is further away. I want to try to employ the most proximal muscles when I want to exert the maximum amount of force. I can use my distal faculties to be more mobile. So the further you get away from your core, the more mobility you generally have. So I can be mobile by using my distal faculties, and I can apply braking pressure by using the largest, most proximal muscles in my body. So that's kind of the biomechanical side of things. It's really straightforward. Don't bend your spine too much, and try to use the biggest muscles in your body whenever you can. That's really all it comes down to. On top of that, we can talk about a few physical principles that you're going to keep in mind, right? The basic idea, frames and levers will play a huge role. Frames, locking out my skeleton in a way where I'm preventing someone from coming close to me. So if you don't mind, if you stand up for a second, Kesting. This is a great example. If I just frame his chest, if my shoulders are not aligned, so it might not be hard to tell, but right now my shoulders are not aligned. Okay, if he drives into me, oh man, I'm going to collapse, okay? But if I align my shoulders, if I pull my shoulder blades back and down, okay, and my shoulders are in a straight line, he can do all he wants here. I mean, if he redirects the frame, that's going to be a problem. But as long as I keep my arms in a straight line, my shoulders are not up and down here, okay, my right shoulder's not lower than my left, they're in a straight line. I'm not rotating on to the side, I'm locked out. And this is a great drill to have students do, because this shows you this is a proper frame, right? Okay. Conversely, levers. Levers would be enacting upon the end of a frame. So if I extend my arm towards Stephan, if he grabs the end of that frame, okay, he's going to turn this into a lever. He moves this out of the way. And by accessing the end of the lever, this is the most efficient way of controlling the limb. So if you stay standing for a second, something I like to show new students on a regular basis, this is kind of out of the context of jiu-jitsu, but if he puts his arm up on the side like this, don't let me pull your arm down, right? I like to do this demonstration regularly with beginners. If I push down here, it should be pretty hard for me to pull his arm down towards the ground. And if I go down to the end of the lever, it's super, super easy for me to move his arm. I like to demonstrate that on, someone's first day, maybe second day, because it's a really, really clear example of leverage, right? You're going to use the end of the lever whenever possible. That might be the knee. It might be the elbow. The head is the end of the lever to the entire spine. Always trying to access the end of the lever. a few other things. We have angles, and we have range, which play quite a role together. Angles, I always want to face my opponent. I want my hips and my shoulders pointed towards my opponent because that's where I'm most effective. With that in mind, I want my opponent to be faced away from me. So this is perfect. I would start a fight here anytime. This is great. And this plays out in a much smaller way in every exchange that we do. If I'm trying to pass the guard, if I can turn your hips away from me, great. So like I'm in a position like this. If I can move around you and you're pointed away from me, I'm pointed at you, I am in an advantageous position. I have a dominant angle at this moment. Okay? Range plays a substantial role as well. So in a position like this, if I'm out of range, Stephan can't do anything to me. Okay? Can't even touch me at all. If I'm right here, and I'm not really addressing what he's doing, this is a much closer range. He is much more able to control me from this position. So I manage range. I don't let him control me. I control him. Once I'm controlling him, then I can move into range and begin attacking. If he ever causes me any issues, he starts trying to grab a hold of me, I just get free, I back away, I manage the range and reset so I'm no longer in danger. All right? Couple other things, we'll just leave it with center of gravity, momentum, and timing plays a big role as well. Center of gravity, if I'm standing upright, my center is directly underneath me. If I start leaning to the side, my center is going to be somewhere over here. I have a center of base and I have a center of gravity. If my center of gravity goes so far away from my ability to base, I'm going to fall over. So if Stephan's on the bottom, let's say maybe I go to a tripod position here. Okay, so I'm centered over my base. He starts moving me, so he just pushes me back a little bit. He's created momentum in one direction. I'm now moving backwards. My center has shifted backwards, my center of gravity, but my base is still kind of in the same position. So he pushes me backwards. I'm like, in order for me to maintain my balance, I need to move forward. I can't just keep going backwards because I will fall. So I will now move forward, and when I do, he can then pull me forward to use my momentum of me correcting my balance to off-balance me even further. Okay? So center of gravity and momentum are going to be major things that we play around with on a regular basis, or that you use on a regular basis. And then finally, timing. Timing is really when I perform a particular movement. So for example, going back to our discussion about different sports, right? If I move one way, so if you're on the bottom and I want to pass your guard, I don't typically do this, but just so you have an idea. If I move to one side, Stephan's eventually going to have to face me, right? See, he turns to face me. He has to do that. If he doesn't do it, I will pass. I'll move right to his back. So this is a predictable response. I move to one side. As soon as he moves, he's created momentum in one direction. He has to come to a full stop before he can go back the other way. And I know that's the reality of it. So if I move to one side, as soon as he starts to move, I move the other way. He goes to move to face me again, I move the other way again, and I gain even more ground in terms of developing a dominant angle. So that's the timing. I'm timing it when I recognize he's created momentum to move in one direction. I know he's going to continue to move in that direction for at least some period of time. That's when I want to go the other way. Okay, so that's how I determine when we want to do something. That makes sense?
Yes.
Fantastic. A few other little things. One, we're really focusing on movement here. We want you to be able to move between all the major positions and transition between them. We're not so much focusing on control. There is a little bit of control involved. But generally speaking, if you're able to move efficiently and you can get to different positions, it's quite easy once, like if I get into a rear naked choke position, it's not so hard for me to finish that rear naked choke versus, having to actually get to the position to finish the choke. If I have you in a fully extended armbar, it's not that hard to finish the armbar, but it's really hard to get to the position to actually perform that armbar. So we're focusing on the movements that allow you to get to these positions, and that's the foundation of your game. If you can move and transition between all the major positions, you're going to be able to recognize what to do in virtually every scenario, and you're going to be able to use those gross movement patterns to benefit you when you start developing or learning more advanced skills. So they're kind of the building blocks to the rest of jiu-jitsu.
So, as I understand it, I don't think we're going to be covering closed guard today. Mm-hmm. Is that an example of wanting to focus on guards that require movement as opposed to guards where you can kind of lock somebody in place? Exactly.
There's absolutely a ton of validity to closed guard for sure. However, as a beginner, we want you to learn how to move. With closed guard, if someone loops their legs around you and just holds onto you, that can be a very challenging problem to solve as a beginner. But your opponent isn't having to use much skill to make that's so challenging for you. They're just holding their legs very tightly around you. So it's limiting movement. So we want to stay away from limiting movement when we start. That's part of the reason we're not going over it. Frankly, the other major reason is there are a lot of resources on closed guard, and you can figure out how to create a closed guard game where I start in closed guard, my opponent has a couple of options, I'm trying to escape. It's something that's been done. A lot of what we're doing has been touched on much less than just like an isolated closed guard game. So it's partly the fact that we do want you to focus on movement, and partly that that resource is something that you can likely come up with if you're a coach or if you're relatively experienced in jiu-jitsu. You can extrapolate the way that we're doing what we're doing today to easily create a closed guard game. And maybe that's something we could do down the road as well. I'd like to add as well that, and we're going to discuss this a few times, but it can't be overemphasized, and it's your temperament that you approach training with. You
Never lose, never tap.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. That's exactly it. Adopt that mentality and you will be successful. Really, if you are able to be more efficient in your learning today, you will be better in the long run and you will win more in the long run. Accept loss today, generally, unless you're already really good and you got to search out people that can actually beat you. Accept loss today at the gym. Okay? If someone tries to beat you in a particular position, you're not trying to beat them. You're not trying to win. Okay? What you're trying to do is perform the right movement at the right time. You're trying to remember the most efficient thing to do in that scenario and practice that thing. That is winning. You're doing the thing that's going to help you become better. That's winning, not actually tapping out your training partners. Of course, there's a huge argument to be made that tapping someone out is actually how you win jiu-jitsu. But we're talking about being efficient in terms of your development in the long term. I also wanted to address the idea of conceptual terminology, concepts, principles. I will allude, I'll use a number of concepts and principles in this instructional. I will not go into great depth beyond sort of what we've provided right now and little tidbits throughout the instructional.
If only there were other resources.
If only there were already other great resources that you could reference, right? So those exist primarily with Rob Biernacki and Stephan. He has bjjconcepts.net, head instructor at Island Top Team. I'm sure most of your fans, are associated or understand who Rob is. So I won't elaborate on those. I am a black belt under Rob, so massively influenced from his approach in my training. But that's just to say I'm not going to go super in depth and take a lot of time to say, these are the concepts for this section. I'm trying to use the concepts overall to apply to all sections, and I will mention them from time to time.
So Cal, it really seems like there's a spectrum in jiu-jitsu right now, ranging from one end where some instructor teaches a technique. First you do this, then you do this, then you do that. First you do this, first you do that, then you do this, then you finish the arm bars. 1, 2, 3, 4. Either of a random bunch of techniques, or they have a curriculum where the first 30 techniques you learn for blue belt, say, and you have to memorize the 3 to 7 steps for each technique. That's at one end, very, very procedural. Mm-hmm. At the other end, there's a movement that's growing where you basically, the philosophy is you just spar or drill. You don't teach technique per se. You just set up the right training drills or the right sparring drills, and students will discover all the techniques themselves that they need to know. And that's a spectrum. Where are we falling in between those two extreme ends? And of course, that's oversimplifying because almost nobody is at one end or the other. Even the schools that are not teaching any technique, those students are still going and watching techniques on YouTube and then trying them out in class. It's a reverse classroom approach. Where are we on this, or where are you on this teaching technique versus just drilling? By drilling, we mean sparring, drilling against resistance.
Yeah. I like to think I'm taking an approach where I'm pretty close to the middle. What it comes down
Doesn't
to
everyone
is...
describe themselves as centrist these days?
Probably.
Okay,
That's how I'd like to approach this. In terms of how it compares to what I think is more prevalent in jiu-jitsu today, we're probably closer to that ecological approach, or I hate to say it, but like discovery learning. Discovery learning, as I understand it, is, let people do jiu-jitsu and they'll figure out how to do jiu-jitsu on their own. Eventually over time, it'll evolve into, they'll be world-class competitors after 10 years of just playing without any instruction.
And there have been some people who have just been thrown to the wolves, and they're amazing athletes who have become world champions that way.
In spite of that approach, right? it's much more likely that
or maybe they're an anomaly where that's the perfect mix of training methods.
Absolutely.
But
no, and I'm completely open to the fact that there are outliers, there are exceptions. That's going to happen. I'm trying to take an approach where, number one, if you have a very complex technique, it's a lot of a cognitive load. You're going to have to hold a lot in your mind at one time to develop that technique. If you're an absolute beginner, there might be a reasonable amount of strain on your ability to hold the ideas in your mind at once to practice one pretty basic movement for someone who's done this for a while. For example, a leg drag. I move into a position and I'm practicing something that looks like a gross movement pattern. It looks relatively basic, but it could be a lot for me as a beginner. So what I'm trying to do is say, there are these larger movements that you want to learn first in Jiu-Jitsu. We're focusing on being able to get to particular positions. So we're using gross movement patterns. So side-to-side movement, windshield wipers, spin behinds, these broad movement categories that allow you to move in and out of different positions. Once you're able to get to those positions and control them to a certain degree, then we can worry about fine-tuning what you'll do next to move into even deeper control positions like submissions and so on.
So when we're picking transitions and control positions or submissions, how do we know what to focus on? What's your heuristic for what you chose to show today, which we're assuming is probably going to be a coach who's teaching, a father who's teaching his couple of kids, people who aren't attending class but they're training in a garage gym. That's what I'm assuming is the demo. People who want to get together before and after class and do some extra training. Why are we focusing on the techniques that we're using?
Perfect. Really, these are the most proven techniques at the highest level that beginners can begin to practice, okay? If you were to take the highest level of jiu-jitsu and distill it all down into these are the most effective techniques, there are more advanced techniques, right? Like we aren't covering arm bars. We aren't covering forms of kimuras, different submissions, different leg locks. But when it comes to the fundamental movements that are performed at the highest level, if you watch the best athletes in the sport, they use the movements that we go over to end up in deeper control positions. So they use these movements all the time. Some of these movements are really straightforward, right? It's like lateral movement, how to move side to side. That can open up a lot of doors to a lot of different things. If you're able to move side to side effectively, you can plug a lot of things into those movements to improve your game.
And more importantly, when to move side to side. And developing the timing component that you talked about it earlier.
Exactly. And that's how it works in a sense of play. When both players have an idea of what they're trying to achieve, then I have to develop responses that make sense in the context of this is a skilled opponent. Okay. If you're relatively new to jiu-jitsu or if you've never done it before, maybe you're trying to teach your kids, you won't recognize when you're performing a technique that works against someone who isn't skilled at all versus what works at the higher level. This is a really hard thing to understand when you first start because you think like, well, I did it and it worked. So what's wrong with it? And it's like, hey, I'm not trying to discredit the fact that it worked in this scenario. I'm trying to assist you in terms of don't focus on that. As you get better, it's not going to benefit you to focus on those skills that work against untrained opponents.
So, for example, there's many ways to take the back if I'm in a shitty turtle. If I think this is my turtle,
yeah,
you can just walk over and put your hooks in, essentially.
Yes.
And you can do that a lot against white belts who have never trained before. But then as they get better, like if that's what you focus your training on, if I understand you correctly, then that's going to stop working very soon.
And you can invest your time in something. So invest your time in things that are going to work for you in the long run. Because not only will they work against unskilled opponents, they'll also work against skilled opponents. When we're training with this methodology, we're making sure to train the offense and the defense at the same time, right? So the defensive player is going to understand this is the alignment that I need. I need to make sure my arms and legs are in this position. I want to make sure my center of gravity is in this particular position. And I want to move at this particular time. We also teach the offense. These are the movements that are effective from the defensive perspective. This is how you're going to respond to those particular movements, right? So we're teaching offense and defense at the same time.
So both people are getting better.
Both people are getting better and both people are being guided in a way where they're performing movements that will work as they continue to get better. At a certain point, like people say this all the time, but jiu-jitsu is not magic. Every single battle in jiu-jitsu is truly a battle. Nothing just works because you're inherently able to do something that the other person isn't able to do. There is no magic whatsoever. There are just little inches that the better player gains on a regular basis over and over again because they have a slightly better angle. They access slightly more leverage when they perform a particular technique. They've broken your posture. Maybe you come in and you're not very athletic and so on. They gain ground in all these little areas, but it's still a battle in every single position. And I don't remember where I was going with that.
That both people are going to be getting better because they're going to be battling out they're going to be having these micro battles all the time. And we're focusing on, if I understand you correctly, we're focusing on the micro battles that'll keep on working as their skill level goes up.
Exactly. And that's a huge part of why we're doing offense and defense at the same time. I've had the experience where you teach a particular player maybe the offense for a particular technique and they try to perform that technique, or I've had instances where I've taught players defense for a particular technique and they know what to do against a skilled opponent, but they don't know what to do against someone who's just throwing up random stuff that wouldn't work if they knew the response to those really uncommon techniques that there are holes. So if someone performs a low-level technique, okay, if I am a little bit experienced in jiu-jitsu, I might have trouble dealing with this low-level technique because I'm not recognizing the hole. It's a low-level technique because there's a massive problem with that technique. It's like someone's pinning me down here. It's like, yeah, but if you just push into their hip, they're going to flip right over top of your head. There's a really easy way to solve that problem. Higher level techniques, there's generally not a really easy way to solve the problem. You have to be fundamentally sound in a number of different ways to make sure that you can deal with someone who's presenting high-level techniques.
Or you can get snookered thinking that the person is setting you up for something. I remember years ago, in the fire department, rolling with this really big, really strong, not super intelligent guy. And I had him in my closed guard, and I was about to say, baiting me by putting his forearm across my neck. And I was like, oh, he's trying to bait me into going for an arm bar. So then he's going to try passing my guard. And then realizing, no, he has no idea what he's doing. I'm giving this entirely too much credit. There's a very simple solution here. So that you can go sideways there as well by giving too much credit to the person who doesn't have any technique. When there's a super simple answer, armbar him.
Definitely. But I think on the whole, it's more effective to lean towards us. Like when I'm training and someone's doing something incorrectly, I will expose it, like if it can easily just sweep them because their center of gravity is so far off. But I try not to rely on that as frequently as possible because
it doesn't benefit you or it doesn't benefit them.
Exactly. It will benefit them if I do it once. I do it once and it's like, hey, you're completely off center here. That's why I was able to sweep you so easily, right? But then after we address that, I don't want to sub someone in a way where it's super easy for me to sub them because it's like, oh, I could guillotine you right now because your hands aren't defending your neck. I'm not going to go for it because sure, maybe I will sometimes, but if I just guillotine them and it's super easy for me, I'm not really learning. But if I feel the person start defending like crazy, then I'm like, oh yeah, sweet. I'm going to try to guillotine this person because I'm going to get better through this exchange. So I did go about choosing the structure of the content in a way where we want you to experience the majority of positions within jiu-jitsu, the majority of guards. Okay, so guards where you're playing on your back, guards where you're seated. You're touching on X guard, single leg X, tripod, a little bit of deli hiva. We want you to have exposure to each one of these positions. We don't touch on some things, for example, half guard, we're not going to play here, but we want you to have exposure to each one. And there's a couple of reasons why. Primarily, everyone's going to develop their own game. You're going to recognize that you enjoy doing certain things. Your particular structure, the way your body is, like your height, your weight, and so on, are going to lead you towards, and your temperament and your personality, are going to lead you towards certain areas within jiu-jitsu that you're going to enjoy playing more, or they're going to work better for you. So you need to have exposure to pretty much every area of jiu-jitsu so you understand each piece. But one thing that's really enjoyable as a student and a coach is watching people go down their own avenues and identifying what it is that works best for them. So we provided a framework where you're touching on each major position within jiu-jitsu, and from there, a good coach or someone with a decent amount of experience can recognize you're showing a little bit of a proclivity to this specific movement or this specific guard. Let's develop that guard a little bit more, right? We don't have to worry about developing all the guards. You definitely are never going to be good at everything in jiu-jitsu. You'll be good at a select number of things. This lets you touch on each one of those things. And you need to have knowledge of each one of those things because in terms of defense, you will deal with these problems because everyone has a different game. So we very much intentionally set this up so that you will have exposure to the majority of exchanges that you'll encounter within jiu-jitsu, and you have at least one or two options for the majority of those particularly common exchanges.
Let's just finish off by talking a little bit about training session or class design. Obviously, some people are watching, they go to a school, there is a preordained structure. We do 30 minutes of jumping jacks and push-ups, then we do 30 minutes of technique, and then we do 10 minutes of sparring, or whatever inefficient method that school, I would argue that is an inefficient use of time. They don't have a choice. But a lot of people do have choices about how they structure their additional training, how they're structuring teaching their kids, to use a previous example, how they're structuring the classes that they're teaching. So what would you argue is an efficient use of training time using the methods and the philosophies that you've developed and that we flesh out in the rest of this instructional?
Perfect. So it's organized in a way where we build off of each section. So, for example, the first game involves passing and guard retention, getting past someone's legs and preventing someone from getting past your legs. The first two movements that you'll go over involve moving laterally and then controlling your opponent's legs and moving your opponent's legs laterally. So I would highly suggest to approach this training in the sense where you're going to start off with one section, one game. You'll play a little bit of that game. You'll learn the first couple movements and you'll more or less drill those movements. You'll keep the intensity very low. You'll let each training partner go through the motions of practicing like, okay, I can feel my balance, my center of gravity. I'm supposed to move in this particular way. I control the ankles like this.
Oh, so when you say drill,
yeah,
you mean just repeat the movement without resistance?
Without much resistance at the very beginning,
yeah,
right? And then you slowly start to add resistance. And then as you become more comfortable with that basic exchange, you add the next piece and you add the next piece and so on. I would also suggest, rather than just getting good at one game right off the bat, start playing the majority of the games and just play the first section of a bunch of the different games. Some of the games are longer and have much more material, so some of them work a little bit better in that sense. But rather than neglecting certain skills and only practicing one skill, I would definitely suggest playing the beginning portion of multiple games, and you're able to play those games after you spend, really depends on where you're at. If you're brand new to jiu-jitsu, you could probably spend 20 to 30 minutes on just going over a couple of movements, right? Like side to side passing and playing with the leg drag. My opponent on the bottom, I'm gonna ask them, I'm gonna say, hey, if you can just keep your structure like is shown in the video, I wanna go through these motions and just play with this movement so I can get comfortable moving in this way. And then as soon as I feel like a decent, like a little bit of proficiency, it's like, okay, make this a little bit more challenging for me. Move just a little quicker. Don't move fast. Just move a little bit quicker. Frame me a little bit earlier. Make it a little more challenging for me. And then you continue to do just those same movements. Like don't add more movement. Just do those two movements. After you get to a point where you feel like you're playing, you're pretty much just having a good time and you're not having to think about it too much, then definitely add in the next section. And the same thing happens there. You slowly start adding in those movements. You start very slow. It's actually, I would think that this would be the intuitive way to approach it. You take a movement, you begin playing with that movement until you have a little bit of proficiency. You start playing a game with another person where they're reacting to your movements. You go a little bit faster, make it a little bit more intense, but at no point should it be extremely intense. The only point at which it should be really intense is when you're basically making your own instructionals or you're at a level where you're very, very competitive. And I say that, and I'm not like some crazy competitor who wants to rip everybody's head off at all. I ended up focusing more on the coaching side. But my point is, really, you should adapt a mindset where training is fun, it's enjoyable, right? You're getting exercise, you're socializing, you're being cognitively stimulated because you're having to think about what you're doing. You should enjoy the process. It should be a fun time to do jiu-jitsu. If you're attacking your friends, you're ripping each other's heads off, you're hyperextending joints, you're doing it wrong, for sure. People might argue against that and say like, oh, jiu-jitsu is a fight and so on. I completely disagree. I completely disagree with the fact that you're training. My point is your training should be enjoyable, it should be fun, and you will develop skill the fastest if you find that sweet spot where you're cooperating to a degree that you're both developing skill. You're not going full tilt, you're not using all your athleticism, you're not crazy exhausted. However, there is a place for that from time to time.
So I make you an offer you can't refuse. I run a school somewhere, I don't know, middle of the continent, and I want you to teach my beginner's program.
Yep.
We've been going for a month or two, and I come in to see what you've done. What do I see in that 1 hour, in those 90 minutes? What do you do first? What are you doing first with those people? What are you doing second? How much, what does a class structure, typical class structure look like, given that you're training fairly low-level people with a little bit of experience?
Okay, I do like to mix it up a little bit. I do like to keep people on their toes, and sometimes I will mix up the structure of a class. But on average, the beginning of the class is, we're going to focus on this particular skill set today.
So how about jumping jacks? How about push-ups?
Doesn't happen at all.
Okay.
The warm-up is getting familiar with a particular movement that's a part of Jiu-Jitsu. And if you're doing that movement correctly, you're using the right biomechanics for that movement. And to go off on a slight tangent here, this is the problem with unqualified instructors, right? It's like having an unqualified personal trainer teach you how to squat incorrectly, how to deadlift incorrectly, how to perform movements incorrectly that slowly over time actually break your body down. So when you start Jiu-Jitsu, you start the beginning of a class, the movements you're going over are Jiu-Jitsu movements that you're performing with a biomechanically correct alignment. So we'll pick a movement. Let's say again, we'll stick with the leg drag. I'll show the students the leg drag. I'm nice and postured up. I'm modeling the behavior toward the students. I show them we're moving the legs to the side. I take a lateral step. I squat down and I move into this position. It's very much drilling in the sense of a step-by-step situation, but that's very short-lived. It's just, let's prime this movement pattern. Let's get a sense for what it's going to look like, and then let's make sure the defensive player also has the complement to the movement that I'm trying to perform. If they're very new and this is brand new material, we might stop with just one exchange. Like, I do one thing, you do one thing. But generally, we're going to try to have a complement. I want to be able to do two things because I want to try one thing, and then as you defend it, I want to have a follow-up that plays on your defense. So I have a 1-2, a jab cross, a jab cross. I jab towards your head, you block your head, I cross you in the stomach, that kind of thing, right? Same thing with Jiu-Jitsu. I want to train at the beginning of class some movement pattern that we're going to go over that's going to be a part of the games we're going to play. Then we'll get into that actual game. So in the sense of passing, okay guys, we went over the leg drag pass, we tied that into the side-to-side or Toriendo pass. Now, let's do this live. Try to pass your opponent's guard with side-to-side passing in the leg drag. Then we might play a game afterwards that says, hey, try to pass the guard. Don't worry about having to use the leg drag and Toriendo, although I highly suggest incorporating it into whatever you choose to do. But now, pass the guard in using any of the other techniques we've learned before. Play the same game, but a little more broad. And now I'm going to jump into another game. I'm going to say, for whatever reason, based on the fact that we haven't played this game in 2 or 3 days, we're going to jump into the engagement phase game. We're going to do that, and then we might jump into back control and back escapes. We might tie some games together. We might say, all right, we've been doing passing and guard retention for quite a while now. You're pretty proficient with the majority of the basic options. Let's tie this into the top control game. We'll play 2 games at once. So the game doesn't stop once someone passes. The game stops once maybe someone takes the other person's back. Really, that would be the only point you'd stop. Or the opponent on the bottom just never lets you pass their guard in the first place. So we want to make sure we structure it so that beginning of class, broad movement patterns that are going to be effective for the particular skill set we're working on that day. Then we want to incorporate that into a game. We play that game. That's the primary focus of the class. Maybe that's the first 30 minutes or so. It's focusing on that one thing. And then the second 30 minutes is let's recall all these other games that we're familiar with. So we're basically firing those neurons for all those different games. And within a week, if you show up 2 to 3 times in a week, you should be playing all of those games at least once in a week. There are arguments to be made where it's like, for example, engagement phase. It's it's not a very deep game. We don't provide a lot of options in the engagement phase. However, if there's a tournament coming up and students are participating in that tournament, we're going to do a lot of engagement phase work because it's essential you win the engagement phase at a tournament. You need to win from the beginning of the match. So aside from something like that, generally, you're just going to evenly spread the different games across a week. So students are at least touching on each game once in a week. And then you focus on a specific game, the specific movement patterns for that game at the beginning of the class when everybody's usually generally pretty awake and ready to learn new information. I definitely want to touch on zero-sum theory and how it applies to Jiu-Jitsu. No need to overcomplicate this. The basic idea of zero-sum we start a match, and Stephan and I have an equal number of resources at our disposal. Okay, let's assume we are perfectly the same athletically. All right, same weights, we can lift the same amount of weight, we have the same amount of experience in athletics. It's virtually the same person. Okay, in zero sum, right now, neither of us have control. 0 equals 0. If I get a grip on Stephan, let's say I get a grip on his collar, I get a grip on his sleeve, and I start to off-balance him in whatever fashion, right? I now have some control that's effective I'm breaking his posture, I'm opening up his structure, so I'm separating his arm from his body, and now I start doing whatever I want to do to continue to break his alignment. So we started off where our resources were 0-0. I've gained control over Stephan. The goal of the game of Jiu-Jitsu is to control your opponent to the degree that they end up having to tap because you're controlling them so thoroughly. So if I gain control over Stephan at the beginning of a match, like I get grips on his sleeves, whatever the case may be, and I start separating his limbs from his body, I now have more control over Stephan, and he is that much less able to control me. So it's extremely critical that if you're competing or trying to win a match, and this is where the methodology of how to learn jiu-jitsu and how to actually compete jiu-jitsu differ. If you gain control over your opponent, their ability to control you is now diminished to the exact degree that you're now controlling them. If I end up on your back and I have you in a rear naked choke, your ability to control me is almost 0, unless, you cross your legs and it's the end of the match, So recognize that every time your opponent gains ground on you, you're now that much less able to beat your opponent. Like, you're going to be that much less effective at beating them. So this is kind of what plays into the idea that jiu-jitsu is not magic. If you let someone get on your back, if you let a beginner put you in a locked-in rear naked choke, I mean, you might be able to get out if they're very new or very weak, but generally speaking, the idea is zero sum. Jiu-jitsu is a zero-sum game. If I let you gain control over me, if I start a match in a turtle position, I start at a deficit. You're at a 70% control, and I'm at a negative 70. So the sum is 0 between those two things. As I gain control over you, you lose the ability to control me. So it's really important in a competition situation that I never let my opponent get control over me. I have 100% of my resources. I begin attacking. As soon as they control me at all, I put all my resources. So it's like Stephan gets a grip on my wrist. Okay? This might be diminishing my ability to control him by a fraction of a percent. But let's say it's 1%. So now Stephan is 1 and I'm negative 1. I now have, let's just say I have 99% of my resources left. I'm going to focus all 99% of those resources on breaking this so I can get back to 0 to then re-engage with 100% of my resources to begin attacking. Mm-hmm. If Stephan has control of me to a degree where, he's a plus 30 and I'm a minus 30, if I'm a minus 30, that means, let's say maybe he's got my leg up or, I don't know, he's past my guard. That's a really good example. He's past my guard. He's in a position like this, okay? He has a massive amount of control over me. If I, from here, am like, I'm going to sub you, like I'm going to get an armbar. Of course, there is an opportunity for me to transition into a submission, but my ability to do so is greatly diminished because he's in a much more advantageous position. He can sub me from here in a number of different ways. He is in the best position possible. That's a horrible fucking one. I don't know what I'm talking about. But that's the idea. Yeah, whatever. I'll just finish
my
that.
priority is not to sub him here. My
priority from here is not to try to sub Stephan. It's to use what resources I have left to get him off me and to get my legs back in between us so we can get back to a neutral position so I can use all of my resources to attack. I hope it's clear. Jiu-Jitsu is a zero-sum game. It plays into so many things, so many exchanges. It's not magic. If you end up in a dominant position, it's dominant because they have that much less of an ability to affect you, and you've put them into a position where you have an advantage over them because you're controlling them to that degree.
So Jiu-Jitsu is a zero-sum game, but Jiu-Jitsu training is not a zero-sum because if we do it properly, we're both learning at the same time.
Exactly, which is a positive-sum game, to get real happy, jolly here.
Well, on that jolly note, we should move on and actually start doing some of this stuff.
For sure. Yeah, let's do that.